Anit. So, week 12, we're going to be learning a little bit about Anishinaabe culture and history. I am not Anishinaabe, so obviously, as with when we discussed Haudenosaunee cultures, this is all based on videos and readings that were produced by Anishinaabe people. So, this is all, as is explained in the reading assignments document, this is in line with a visit by a guest who is Algonquin Anishinaabe, and who will be sharing some cultural teachings with us. And so there's more details about the time and date and all that stuff in the reading assignment itself, and you'll be getting the information by Mayo as well. So here is in these slides we'll talk about a few things that are not in the assignment, just to give you some background, but most of it is already in the assignment. I want to start by reminding folks of the importance of respectful vocabulary. So every week you have these little vocabulary quizzes, and they don't just stand on their own. They're meant to help you remember certain things that we've addressed earlier on this semester. And a few weeks ago I posted a PowerPoint devoted to respectful vocabulary, and so this is meant for you to kind of you might have noticed some things keep coming back. Every other week you have some repeat questions, and there's always a couple of new questions based on that week's material. So if you see a question over and over again, it means you're supposed to be integrating this into your other assignments, including the journals, including the reading questions, and of course in your final paper at the end. So here are a few things, but really go back and look at those slides on vocabulary to kind of get the full picture. So all First Nations are Indigenous, but not all Indigenous peoples are First Nations, because remember, Indigenous is an umbrella term similar to Aboriginal and even Native, even though I discourage people from using Aboriginal and Native. We try to stick with Indigenous here, as per the encouragement of many Indigenous activists and scholars. Not every individual agrees, but this is what we're going with these days. So Indigenous peoples, and we capitalize Indigenous. Most of you have been improving on that, but remember, Indigenous includes First Nations, but it also includes Inuit and Métis peoples, all right? And at some point this semester, we're kind of getting close to the end, and there's always a lot to cover, but we'll at least try to have a week devoted to Inuit as well. And because we're in a place where there are a lot of Inuit people, so we're kind of going, local. So so that's really important to remember. And I know it's confusing because I know, for example, Bob Joseph in one of our textbooks, often he'll talk about Indigenous even when he's talking actually about the Indian Act, which only directly affects First Nations people. And so I know it can be tricky, but please try to remember this distinction. It's significant. Now, there are many First Nations. It's not just one group. And here again, we started in the first half of the semester, every couple of weeks we would talk about things related to Haudenosaunee culture, which, again, there are some cultural elements shared by the 6 nations that are a part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So we can kind of talk about Haudenosaunee culture, but remembering that there are 6 different cultures within that, and they're similar, but there are some little variations. So, and very local to us, who are, based at Vanier, which is in a place that's considered to be a part of the traditional territories and homelands of the Kanien'kehá:ka. They are one of the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Now here again, I know some of the articles we read, even though they're written by Kanien'kehá:ka people, sometimes they use Mohawk. And there are some individuals who use Mohawk when they're speaking English because, it might just, there are different preferences around that. But I really encourage you to please, when you're talking about Kanien'kehá:ka people, use Kanien'kehá:ka, because it's the actual word in the Kanien'keha language. Now, I know it looks like a long word, but if you're an English speaker and you learned encyclopedia, you can learn Kanien'kehá:ka. And if it helps, you have it in several documents that I've distributed. Copy it, put it in a document somewhere or in a sticky note somewhere that you can keep, and just paste it. every time you need to write it at first. That's what I did for a number of years until and I'm still practicing with the different punctuations and accents with it. Also, here's a tip I found out recently. If you don't have the A with that particular kind of accent, because that doesn't happen in English and even in French, sometimes in French you have an A with the accent in the other direction, but one's different. You can press Alt 0225, right? So press the Alt button, keep it pressed, and type in 0225, and it'll bring up that A when you need it. Okay, so those are some tips, but really please make this effort, because just like if you would travel somewhere where you don't know the language, you would make an effort to have a little cheat sheet. You wouldn't expect them all to speak your language, so be a good guest, please. And so, but now here's the problem, is that a lot of you in your, little assignments and stuff, not only, some of you have been doing the non-specific thing of talking about Ganyenkehaga people, for example, and just calling them Indigenous or First Nations. And remember, one question that keeps coming back, I keep reminding you in those weekly quizzes, is that we need to be as specific as possible. If you were talking about Vietnamese people, you would say Vietnamese. You wouldn't keep calling them Asian, that larger umbrella term, right? So if you're talking about something that's happening in a Ganyenkehaga community, you're talking about the Ganyenkehaga. You're not saying First Nations all the time or Indigenous all the time. They are First Nations and they are Indigenous, but they're Ganyenkehaga first. The other thing that I've been seeing is that, again, people are forgetting that there are hundreds of nations and cultures. So some people have been talking about things from Haudenosaunee cultures. For example, matrilineal clans, the clan mothers, the structure of the Confederacy, and implying that it applies to all First Nations or all Indigenous cultures. It doesn't. All right, that was specific to Haudenosaunee. So now this week, we're devoting the week to Anishinaabe cultures. So you're going to see that there are some differences there. We're not going as much into kind of the social structure and stuff, but there is a website that you can explore that's given to you in this PowerPoint and learn a little bit more. And there's a couple of little tidbits here and there, okay? And even the creation stories, that's another thing. Sometimes people would talk about the Haudenosaunee creation story with Sky Woman and assume that it applies to all First Nations or all Indigenous people. It does not. Each culture has its own creation story, okay? So please try to remember this, because this is part of the competencies of this course, is to that's why I keep harping on the vocabulary, and I started removing points at some point for things like not capitalizing Indigenous or not being specific enough. So that's going to continue, and it's not to be mean, it's to help guide you towards being, unless somebody hasn't told me that they are Indigenous to here, you're all like me, mostly non-Indigenous, but we're all settlers. We need to learn to be good guests. So, just remember that. All nations have their own cultures and languages, just like other geographical areas in the world, okay? So, okay, now we'll get to the more interesting stuff. So, Anishinaabe. So, one of in the reading assignment this week, I posted an article by Carl Hele, and it's in Canadian Encyclopedia, but because I know Carl Hele is Anishinaabe himself, I considered that to be an acceptable source, because remember, in this course, we're almost exclusively relying on source material that is created by Indigenous authors, filmmakers, and so forth. So in that article, you are being asked to read just the first 3 sections. So there's a little intro, 1 paragraph, that's 1 section, and then there are 2 other sections to look at on, the name, the different groups within Anishinaabe, and the territories, all right? So one of the things you'll see in that article is that he starts off by, one of the first things he talks about is that there are different spellings. So you'll see these different spellings. Don't panic, okay? Anishinaabe is the Ojibwe way of spelling it, but depending on the community, the nation, there are variations in the language here as well. They're very similar. It's one language, Anishinaabe Mowin, which I'm probably not pronouncing properly, but there are variations, right? So there are various ways of spelling things, so don't panic if ever you do more research and you come across these other terms. And today they're centered on the Great Lakes area, and this is a screenshot taken from the article that you are assigned. So you'll see this in the article as well. So so it's spread quite a bit. So there's into Quebec. So you drive north of Montreal and you go up to Maniwaki. There's a community there, Kitigan-Zibi. There are other communities in the area there, and then all the way through Ontario into Manitoba and a little bit into Saskatchewan and into what is now known as the U.S. as well. All right. So there are different First Nations within Anishinaabe, right? So as I mentioned earlier, and this comes from the Hele article, Ojibwe spelling is Anishinaabe, and it tends to be kind of a bit like we saw with Haudenosaunee, where each, there's different spelling and slightly different pronunciation between the 6 nations within the Confederacy, but there tends to be a common acceptance of one of them, which Haudenosaunee is Onondaga, whereas Geha says more closer to Haudenosaunee, or I'm still having a hard time with that one. So the Ojibwe spelling is kind of the very common one, but you have all these other you don't need to learn these by heart, right? But just to be kind of aware that you have these different nations. So if you look at some of them, Odawa, does that sound familiar? Right? Canada's capital, Ottawa, comes from that. And there's even a place called Odawa. And some people who are into, who support Indigenous resurgence sometimes refer to Ottawa as Odawa. Mississauga, same thing, right? You might, if you have been to the Toronto area, you might have heard of Mississauga, right? So that's another grouping within within the wider Anishinaabe group. Algonquin, this one tends to be confusing for some folks sometimes, because sometimes you might hear Algonquian, and Algonquian refers to a language family, which includes Anishinaabe, but also Iu or Cree, Innu, Atskamek, and a whole bunch of other related languages. So don't, try not to confuse those. And individual preference varies, okay? So I know some folks, so Trevor, who's coming, might tend to call himself Algonquin, sometimes Anishinaabe. On the Quebec side, often people will refer to themselves as Algonquin, but sometimes Anishinaabe. So it really depends sometimes on context. Sometimes, like within the bigger group, people will want to distinguish themselves according to these nations, but to people from outside, especially with non-Indigenous people, sometimes people will feel a pride in saying Anishinaabe because they're part of this wider group of First Nations. And sometimes people will say both, all right? So it's important to know this, right? Because there's always, and Chelsea Vowell's first chapter talks about this where, okay, chapters don't talk. It's not an essay, so I can just say that. That it can be confusing, and then, so it's always with individuals best to ask. So, I'm clicking. All right. So there we go. So migration history, again, it's from that same article, this information here. So northeast coast of what is now known as Canada and the U.S. is said to be where the Anishinaabe peoples originated. And over time, and this is before colonization, there was what some people call the Great Migration to the area that we saw on the map on the previous slide, in the direction of Lake Superior. And along, so when we look at that wider area that on that map that we looked at, we see there are communities located along that migration route. So that's why even just north of Montreal, you start to have some Anishinaabe nations and communities. And then, of course, with colonization, you had more migration. So they didn't stop necessarily at the Great Lakes. There was kind of some movement west and south as well. In terms of relations with settlers, so again, this is all from the same article. The earlier on, Anishinaabe peoples participated in the fur trade, so they were trading partners, so stuff we've talked about before. Hele lists a bunch of wars in which Anishinaabe people were involved as military allies, either to the French, the English, or Americans. And when we talked about treaties, so all those, remember there were 2 chapters on treaties from Chelsea Vowell, one that was older treaties and then one kind of during the period of Confederation. And so these are some treaties that Carl Helle talks about. So Treaty Niagara is a big one, but also those numbered treaties where, you know, those land cessation things where people were tricked into signing treaties where they thought they were sharing the land, but the federal government had actually written that they were giving up the, you know, First Nations peoples were actually giving up the land. So when we watch Trick or Treaty, you know, that's very relevant here. So all those numbered treaties that Chelsea Vowell talks about, especially kind of in through Ontario and Manitoba and those areas. Let's see. So one the other aspect of this week's reading questions is that we're also going to expose you a little bit to some teachings, so some spiritual teachings. So we started the semester when we talked about Haudenosaunee. Well, of course, it's very local to where we are, so we start there. But Anishinaabe people have a relationship with this area too, because there are communities nearby, and also, you know, even when you start to talk about, say, Ganazadage, which is a Gayengehaga community, which you learned about 2 weeks ago, there were, you know, Anishinaabe people in that area as well for a while. All right, so there is a history, there's a historical connection here that Anishinaabe people have with this place. So it's important to kind of learn different versions of, or be exposed to different versions of the creation story, but also other related teachings. So there, in the assignment, you'll see you're given a choice of you know, one of several things. If you're interested in the creation story, there's a text version of the Algonquin version, and then there are 2 videos with a retelling of the Ojibwe version, and you'll see that so Algonquin is closer to where we are, and Ojibwe is further west, and you know the stories are very, very similar, but there is one key difference, is that the main character in the east is Wisakajak, and if you go west, it's Nanabuju or Nanabush, depending on, you know, local pronunciation. So if any of you have been to Thunder Bay, you might have heard of Nanabush, because there's a little mountain range when it said that's where he's sleeping, he's lying down, and it really does look like a person lying down. And so, and this image here is taken from this first website here. So this story, ultimately, whatever version you read or watch, explains where the term Turtle Island comes from. And you'll also see some similarities with the Haudenosaunee creation story, but it's very significantly different as well. In a nutshell, what is one of the things that's common to all versions is that at some point, you know, the creator created the world, all right, and you know, it wasn't just about humans. The animals could talk, and they participated, and there were, you know, relations between humans and other creatures, and the task was to get along and be harmonious. And at some point, people started being at war with each other and, you know, fighting and stuff like that. So the creator got annoyed and flooded the world. And then, so depending on the version, you either have Wisakajak or Nanabush or Nanabujo who survived, and then with the help of other animals rebuilt the world, and it winds up having, you know, the shape of a turtle. So that's, you know, depending on whether you'd rather read or watch a video. You can look at them all if you want, and if you have the time and interest, obviously, but you're only being asked to look at one of these 3, or, you know, in the assignment you see these are listed as well. So if you're interested more in kind of spiritual teachings, not just necessarily the creation story, but they're the 7 grandfather teachings that that originate in Anishinaabe culture. And so the grandfather teachings sometimes have become part of the, what some people call the pan-indigenous spiritual movement. It's teachings that have spread and that other people have adopted, because we haven't talked about it yet, but the 60s scoop, which happened after residential schools, where a lot of First Nations and other Indigenous kids were taken from their homes and adopted by non-Indigenous parents, and later tried to find their identity. Well, often, sometimes in urban contexts like Jojage or Montreal or Toronto, what gets taught is stuff that comes from Anishinaabe culture. So you do have a lot of people who are not Anishinaabe who kind of follow the grandfather teachings. So you can either look at a video where they're explained or read a text version. It's very beautiful stuff, and it kind of it they'll give the Anishinaabe term, but a translation in English, and kind of give an explanation. And these are kind of values to live by, in other words. I'm very concept of one of the teachings that it refers to humility, where it's like to know your place, know that you have gifts, but also know that you don't know everything, and so that we're all kind of part of this together. I think that's something that is really important to me. So this one here, this is optional. So if you download the PowerPoint, you'll be able to click on this. It's a nice website, and what's going to happen when you click on this is that it'll take you to this interactive site. It might take you to a page where you have to choose which version of the site, and if that does happen, if you don't go straight to the interactive component, you can choose interactive content. But the link might take you straight to the interactive content, so it depends on your browser and all kinds of things. So what you'll do is you can either, if you want to hear the little 2-minute intro, you can click on the yellow arrow, or you'll see also at the bottom of the square, skip intro. So it's up to you if you want to listen to the intro or not. And then okay, this should say 5 circles. You'll see an image with 5 circles. I'll change this after. So for this week's, if you want to know more about Anishinaabe culture, you can click Ojibwe, which is one nation within Anishinaabe, right? And so you'll click Ojibwe, then that circle's going to become big, and then at the very bottom you'll see a little line of 6 little rectangles. So you can start with the intro on the left and work through the different directions. So there's north, south, east, and west, but also above and below, I think, or center. I think it's center. Yeah, center. I was mixing with pagans. And so also, if you like subtitles, because you're like me and you're visual, you can, next to that line of rectangles, there's a little square marked sub. You can click on that and there will be subtitles. So this is for those of you who want to explore a little bit more of these teachings, or you can save it to look at in the future. And also up here, when you have those 5 circles, there's also, you'll see Mohawk. Remember what I said in the first slide? And Cree. You'll see kind of like 5 different nations represented there that you can learn more about as well. So that's for future self-learning. So just to wrap things up here, just a few cultural elements that are common. And again, there's variation from place to place, right? But just to kind of understand some differences between Anishinaabe cultures and Haudenosaunee cultures, here there's a link that you can access through the slides once you download them, the Algonquin Nation website. So this is kind of on the Quebec side, but also a bit on the Ontario side. You have people who identify as Algonquin. So their traditional way of life, again, we learned with Haudenosaunee is very based in agriculture. There's some hunting, but the culture is heavily centered on agriculture, corn, beans, and squash, things like that. Whereas you go further north, you get into Anishinaabe territory. Traditionally, it's mainly been hunting and gathering, which is not a primitive way of existing, right? It requires a very rich knowledge of the environment, because you need to know the seasonal patterns of what grows where, what animals migrate where, the spawning habits of the fish, when's a good time to fish and where. Like that's all intergenerational knowledge that's passed down. So like many other people who've traditionally subsisted in this way, the people would get together in larger gatherings in the summer usually, and that's when feasts would happen, weddings, different kinds of celebrations. And then in the winter, people would kind of disperse among traditional family grounds. And that's when in anthropology we talk about nomadic people, that's what we mean. It's not this endless wandering, it's people kind of moving back, or circulating within a territory. Okay, so that's really important to understand. Chelsea Vowell has that chapter, The Myth of the Wandering Nomad, which helps clarify that. It's, again, not a primitive way of living. It involves very rich, deep knowledge and a deep connection to the land. And on that website, there's some mention about how, yeah, the territories would be kind of assigned to families, but it wasn't like these rigid borders. And they even indicate if somebody's hunting and then the moose that they're following crosses this so-called border, it's not like they would be penalized for it. Then things became different when people started participating in the fur trade, because that's more of a Western economic thing, and it changed things a little bit. Some people were really kind of interested in. There were like two or three of you who were really like into talking about that whole clan exogamy thing with the Haudenosaunee, right? Where you have these matrilineal clans, right? Among the Haudenosaunee, clan membership is inherited through the mother, and you have to, people would marry outside of their clan. Well, here it's not mentioned on this site, but my understanding is that clans are more patrilineal here. So you get your clan membership from your father, which doesn't mean necessarily that they're patriarchal and that men have power over women. So women in these societies have, important voices too. It's just a different structure. And so, but here too, you're expected to marry outside of your clan. So these are kind of just some things. Political system, I mean, different than the whole thing with Haudenosaunee cultures. Ideas of leadership, when you have smaller groupings like this that move around, it doesn't quite work the same way, right? So there's kind of push towards a kind of egalitarianism there in a lot of these societies. So this is kind of a little bit of an overview. Obviously, we're not going into tons of depth. It's 1 week, right? But this can give you a little bit of an idea of how Anishinaabe cultures are different from Haudenosaunee cultures, and also help kind of prepare the terrain to receive our guest, who is going to be focusing on the significance of drumming, and will actually be drumming. All right, and Trevor's a good friend of mine, and he's a mentor of mine as well, so I think it'll be a very enjoyable presentation. So I'll see some of you on Monday if you're watching. If you're watching this before, I'll see you on Monday. If you're watching it after, well, see you maybe in one of the Zoom meetings.